Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this seminar on fake news in the post-factual era. My name is Maximilian Konrad. I'm a professor at the Faculty of Political Science here at the University of Iceland, and I'm also the leader of the Reclaim project, which is a project that looks into the impact of post-factual politics, disinformation, misinformation, fake news, and phenomena like this, the impact on liberal democracies, and particularly what can be done about this. This is a 3-year project funded through the Horizon Europe scheme of the European Commission, and of course it has a very clear connection to what our esteemed guest speaker, Professor Ian MacMullen, is working on himself and what he'll also be presenting on. So it's my pleasure to see that so many of you could make it. I do want to say a few words about the program. I want to thank in particular the US Embassy that has made this visit of Professor MacMullen possible. This is something that we've really wanted to do for quite some time, because one of Ian MacMullen's articles on post-factual politics it appears in some form in every one of my publications on post-truth politics. So I think this is, in terms of citations, I think this is a very underrated article, and everybody who works on post-truth politics, I think, should look at this survey article. I especially enjoy the aspect of motivational post-factualism, which maybe we'll be able to get into in this context. Professor MacMullen is here from the University of Pennsylvania on what I heard, his first trip to Iceland, apart from a layover in Keflavik. He has written 2 books, one called Civics Beyond Critics, Character Education in a Liberal Democracy, and also Faith in Schools, Autonomy, Citizenship, and Religious Education in the Liberal State. And I think that gives me, at least, hopefully also some other people in the audience, an idea why Professor MacMullen's visit to this university is so relevant, given the interest that we have in our project. Our project focuses not only on post-truth politics as a phenomenon in political theory, political philosophy, or in political culture, but we also look at this from the vantage point of what can be done about it in terms of citizenship education. That is, how do we equip young citizens for their role in democracy, given that the information environment is changing and given that they are growing up essentially in an environment in which you can expect that a lot of the information that you're going to be exposed to is flawed, false, possibly deliberately flawed. And I think Professor MacMullen is going to take up some of those aspects. We also have a wonderful panel. I will introduce the panelists afterwards, but first I want to give the floor to Professor MacMullen.
Thank you very much, Max, and thank you all for being here. This has been a wonderful visit so far, a brief one, but I have been delighted by my experiences so far in Iceland, and I want to echo Max's thanks to the various groups that have made this possible. It's possible that I'm going to miss out some of those groups on my list, because it seems like quite a large coalition of groups have made this happen, but the US Embassy, the International Institute, and the Reclaim Project seem like the 3 really big players, and so thank you to the people who represent those different groups and have enabled my visit today. So I thought about giving this talk in Icelandic. I speak excellent Icelandic. Always have done. That may be surprising to you, but many of the people that I have met here in Iceland tell me that I actually speak the best Icelandic of anyone they've ever met, including people from Iceland. And I love Iceland so much. It's such a beautiful country that although I was once thinking about buying Greenland, I'm actually thinking maybe I will buy Iceland instead. Because I have a lot of money and I could buy Iceland, I could afford it. And people tell me that it's for sale. I mean, that's what people say, anyway. So I bring you greetings from the United States of America, but not from the man who talks the way that I was just talking. He doesn't send me on trips very often. But that kind of talk, the kind of outlandishly false assertion backed up by vague references to what people are saying, as if that were a reason to believe. That kind of talk is everywhere in our political culture. I think we owe it to Donald Trump, in a way, to have taken that talk to a new level, but there is no shortage of people around the world who have learned a trick or two in terms of the political efficacy of a kind of talk that, although not unprecedented by any means, there's nothing truly new in the world. But I think there is something, certainly quantitatively, and I think qualitatively different about the kind of discourse that we have been witnessing in, I don't know, roughly the last decade across many countries around the world, and that has come to be known, I guess, under this sort of label of post-factual or post-truth political discourse. And so sometimes when people say, what's going on about this discourse, they mean that, I think, mostly as a gesture of despair, right? It's not a question that they really expect to have answered. It's just a way of expressing confusion, concern, fear about the way that our political discourse is very rapidly evolving, partly, of course, because of the technological capacities that we now have, and the ways in which that has hugely accelerated the capacity for false and outlandish claims to be spread, to go viral, to impact very, very large numbers of people in an extraordinarily short period of time. So some people, I think, say what's going on really just as a way of throwing up their hands and despairing. And what I am trying to do, and I think the folks of the Reclaim Project are trying to do, is to ask the question in an analytical mode, like, what actually is going on? How can we understand this phenomenon, since only by understanding it in an analytical way do we have any chance of counteracting it? And I'm not naive enough to think that this is a genie that we can put back in the bottle. I don't think that just by understanding the problem, a solution will somehow magically appear and that we'll be able to turn back the clock. But I am cautiously optimistic that if we get a better grasp on what's actually happening, that we will be in a position to at least begin to craft some mitigating strategies, right? Strategies that might help to limit the damage that post-factual discourse is doing on democracies, and indeed in non-democracies, but my focus is primarily on how this plays out in a democratic context around the world. So I don't have pictures to show you. You're just going to have to look at this rather arresting image of the two loudspeaker faces talking to each other. If you decide you need something else to look at, I can jump up and down or something. But I don't know about you. I've seen too many PowerPoint presentations in my life so far that I've decided not to contribute another one to your experience. But what I want to do is to not talk for too long, because I've also heard lots of people talk for far too long in these kinds of settings. So I want to talk relatively briefly, and I want to really just do a couple of things. One is to identify what I think is the dominant explanation, either explicit or implicit, for post-factual democratic politics. I actually think that there's a couple of different versions of that kind of orthodox account of what's going on in post-factual politics. So I want to describe that a little bit for the purpose of suggesting that I think it misses a component that I think is also importantly at work in contemporary political cultures. And I want to describe a little bit what I think are some of those other phenomena that I'm not an empirical social scientist. I haven't gone out and measured them, although I think that that might be a worthwhile thing to try to do. But my job is to try to think conceptually. I say my job. I gave myself the job, right? It's not like someone told me to do this. My mission that I have sort of defined for myself is to try to think conceptually about what different kinds of things could be going on in the hope that we then know what we might be looking for when we go out into the world as scholars and social scientists, or just as ordinary citizens who are trying to make sense of the often perplexing and upsetting reality of political discourse. So, the dominant story, I think, about why our politics, or the sense in which our politics has become so post-factual, is a story about false beliefs. It's a story that suggests that lots of regular citizens believe an awful lot of things that are false about topics where perhaps 10 or 20 years ago they would not have had those false beliefs. And I actually think there are two versions of the false beliefs story. The most familiar version, I think, is that people are putting excessive trust in highly unreliable sources, right? This, I think, is roughly the most standard account that you will hear of the problem. Whether it is some, corner of the internet that people decide is authoritative and trustworthy, or it's a particular cable news program or station in America or elsewhere, whether it's the pronouncements of candidates for office themselves, people who claim to tell their supporters how the world really is. The standard account, I think, the most standard account of post-factual politics is that an awful lot of people, and let's be clear about this, I think the standard account is that it's mostly people on the political right. It does happen on the political left, but I think it's an asymmetric phenomenon. There's a lot of people on the political right, on this standard version, who trust some profoundly unreliable sources and therefore end up believing some pretty outrageous things that those sources have discovered that they can get people to believe if they feed them a constant diet of those kinds of claims. So that, I think, is the kind of the most conventional story. And there's lots of subtleties to it, but roughly it's a story about false beliefs that are aroused by unscrupulous sources that a lot of people, particularly on the right, have decided to trust. There's a second version of the story. This is still a version of what I think is kind of the conventional wisdom, which I think is a little bit more interesting, and also, I think, an important part of what's going on. And this is a version of the story that says that actually the people who consume those unreliable sources, the people who are, looking for those corners of the web or watching those cable news shows, don't actually trust what they're hearing there. It's sort of the other way around. These are people who already know what they think, They already have their beliefs, and they go to those sources because they reliably find that those sources reinforce the things that they already believe. So it's not actually a relationship of trust. It's a relationship of wanting someone to tell you something that you already feel like you know. I think some of the sort of evidence for the existence of this phenomenon in the United States, as you may perhaps know this, is that when Fox News, the cable station that is, or certainly was, beloved by many of Donald Trump's supporters, when Fox News accurately made an early prediction in the 2020 election that the state of Arizona would be won by Joe Biden, this triggered mass defections by people who had been watching Fox News loyally for years, because they just weren't willing to accept this. They didn't watch Fox News to be told this kind of thing, even though it turned out to be true. So on this view, it's a mistake to think that the consumers, the ordinary citizens who are consuming a media diet, are sort of blindly trusting what their sources tell them. On this view, actually, they're just looking for a source that will tell them what they, in their gut, feel must be true. And so I think there's, you might say this is also a version of people trusting unreliable sources, but in this case, the sources are inside oneself, so to speak, right? So on a slightly different version of the story, it's still a problem of false beliefs. A lot of people have false beliefs, but it's not that they believe those things because they saw them on TV. It's that perhaps people have an excessive trust in their own very limited direct experience of the world, and they generalize from that and assume that the whole world must be like the little piece of it that they see. So since they don't personally know very many people who voted for Joe Biden, then it just can't be the case that lots of people did vote for Joe Biden, right? So maybe it's people generalizing from their own direct experience, or it's a kind of wishful thinking where people just form beliefs about, on the basis of what they want to be true rather than what, any evidence might suggest. At any rate, there's a variety of stories you might tell about why it is that people sort of trust their gut in this way. But stepping back, there I think are two versions of the dominant story. People believe all kinds of outlandishly false stuff, and that might be because they trust unreliable sources, or it might be because it just feels right to them, and so they consume sources that reinforce that message for them and go looking for a new source if their old source starts telling them something that they don't want to hear. What I have labeled this kind of story about post-factual politics as is unconsciously post-factual politics. So on this account, on both of those accounts, right, because people have false beliefs, but they sincerely believe the things that are false, the people themselves don't think that they're engaged in post-factual politics. What do you mean post-factual politics? I know what's really going on and I vote accordingly, right? This is what folks will say. So post-factual politics on this story is something that other people do, right? No one thinks of themselves as engaged in post-factual politics, right? Because I know the truth and I base my political, behavior on the truth that I know. So this is a kind of diagnostic story where, one looks at other people and says they are engaged in post-factual politics, and they are not conscious of it, so they are unconsciously engaged in post-factual politics. The contribution that I have tried to make to thinking about this issue is to suggest that although, of course, that is a big problem, there are a lot of people with outlandishly false beliefs who are allowing those false beliefs to drive their political behavior. I think this explanation neglects a few possibilities that I put under the heading, perhaps not surprisingly, of consciously post-factual behavior, right? People who knowingly behave in politics in ways that are not guided by beliefs about the state of the world, right? And at first sight, this might seem kind of mysterious, right? I mean, it's one thing to have false beliefs. It's another thing to knowingly disregard the empirical state of the world in behaving in politics. Why would anyone do that? Wouldn't that just be a kind of madness? Well, I don't think it's a kind of madness, although it might be a kind of irrationality looked at in some ways. But of course, people aren't terribly rational, so it shouldn't surprise us deeply if that's what's going on. And so in the little bit of time that remains, I want to just kind of sketch out, as I have done at greater length in my writing, 3 different faces that I think this kind of consciously post-factual behavior can have. Because I think, although, as I say, I'm not an empirical social scientist and I haven't gone out and measured, I think that these are also important elements of what's going on and that is making up what I call the sort of the post-factual political culture. So I've given these names that, maybe they're not the catchiest names, but so I refer to them as metaphysical, motivational, and epistemic. These, unfortunately, are not, the catchiest names, and I'll be glad to change them for better ones if you have any suggestions. But let me describe just briefly what's going on with each of these. So some people have suggested, some scholars have suggested, that the phenomenon of post-factual politics is part of a larger and really kind of radical notion that some people now have, that there are no facts, right? What do you mean, facts? And so that the problem is not one of people having false beliefs, it's that people have abandoned the whole notion that there's anything to have beliefs about, right? I'm a little skeptical that this is as large a phenomenon as some scholars have suggested. Sometimes the claim is made that people have abandoned the idea that there are sort of objective facts about the world, and therefore kind of universal truths, truths that are true for everyone because they're just true. So some people think that the notion of truth and facts has become kind of relativized, right? So there is my truth and there is your truth, but there is no such thing as the truth. And so that's a version of the hypothesis that you sometimes hear, right? That people have abandoned a commitment to objective truth. I am, again, a little skeptical that that's really a very widespread phenomenon. And I think the reason that people sometimes think it's happening is that it's related to a different phenomenon, which is that a lot of people have become distrustful of the objectivity of experts, particularly scientists, and people who, present themselves as impartial experts on some topic area. So I think that there has been quite and I'm sure you've observed this too, there has been quite a strong sort of cultural current in many countries to become increasingly skeptical about the claims that experts make, climate scientists, economists, others. And that, I think, is a troubling phenomenon, the way in which expertise has come to be discredited. Scientists on this account are just another kind of lobby group, so to speak, right? They're just another group of people who have a distinctive kind of perspective and interest that they are trying to advance in the public debate. And we should treat them no differently from an organized political party or something, right? We should approach their claims with the same kind of skepticism and assumption that they are bringing their own biases and their own interests to bear on the debate. But it's one thing to say that you don't trust the the objectivity of science any longer. It's another thing to say that there is no objective fact about the question that's being discussed. And I don't get the sense that actually the people who distrust scientists do so because they've abandoned the whole notion that there is a truth out there, so to speak. So people who are skeptical about climate change or about the efficacy of the COVID vaccine, right? They may doubt the objectivity of science and the scientific community, and that may underlie their skepticism about these scientific claims. But I don't think that, on the whole, the climate skeptics or the vaccine skeptics deny that there is an actual truth of the matter, right? They just don't trust scientists to tell them that truth. So this first way in which you could be a consciously post-factual citizen, you could just sort of say, well, the reason I don't trade in facts is there are no facts. I'm doubtful that that's actually a mainstream position. But the other two, you'll be pleased to know, the other two forms of conscious post-factualism, I have quite a strong hunch are very real, prevalent phenomena that are quite different from the false belief story. So one of them that Max said that he liked in his introduction is what I call motivational post-factualism. And these are folks who basically say, I just don't really care what the facts are. For me, politics it's like a team sport, right? I root for a team. I support my people. It's therefore a story about identity, often a complex mix of racial, cultural, to some extent ideological identity. And so I don't really need to waste much time thinking about whether the things I hear in political discourse are true or false, at least insofar as they are claims about sort of the state of the world, because that's really kind of beside the point, right? I have my people, and I support my people. Again, to continue the sports kind of metaphor, if you want to know whether a particular sports team is the best sports team, you might need to know some facts in order to figure that out, right? You might need to know something about their winning percentage. But if you just want to know whether that sports team is your sports team, right? Well, you don't really need facts for that. So this kind of tribal way of thinking about politics, which I actually think is quite prevalent and not an entirely new phenomenon, but one that I think has been fanned by some of the flames of, well, it's a complex story where this comes from. But this is a kind of motivational way of thinking about post-factualism, right? And so it's not that these folks, when they hear the outlandishly false claims that are out there, it's not that they believe them, they enjoy them. Right? They enjoy them because they think of those claims as nice, clear signals. This guy's on my side, right? The kind of person who would say that is one of my people, right? And one doesn't need to waste time worrying about whether it's true. The point is, it very clearly signals allegiance and identity. And so once you have a sort of critical mass of voters and citizens who are thinking about politics in this kind of motivationally post-factual way, from the perspective of the political elites, right, the candidates for office or the folks with their own show on cable TV or the people writing for websites, it becomes increasingly unimportant to worry about saying things that are actually true, because that's not what your audience is looking for, right? They're not actually interested in hearing and evaluating or forming beliefs on the basis of the things that they're consuming from you. They're looking for entertainment, but more so they're looking for a kind of affirmation and statement of identity. So that's the motivational form of post-factual politics. I don't need to worry about the facts. That's not what I'm looking for. And so then I'll just finish by describing this last form of post-factualism, which I have a hunch is quite powerful too. It's what I call epistemic post-factualism. So epistemic means relating to knowledge and the way that we come to know things. And my theory here is that there's an approach to politics in particular where folks will say, I don't know what to believe. I hear this, but I hear the opposite. And you know what? The folks who are saying this, they have an agenda. And you know what? The people who are saying the opposite, they have an agenda too. How should I know who to believe? Right? And so on this view, there are people who have given up, so to speak, ordinary citizens who have just given up on trying to figure out who's telling the truth, what the real state of the world is. Because our discourse is now so saturated with partisan claims that as a consumer of those claims, it's frankly too difficult, maybe not even really possible for the ordinary citizen to figure out who's reliable, who's unreliable. And so there's a kind of easy solution to that, and that's just to say, I'm just suspending judgment on all of this. Who knows, right? So what I call epistemic post-factualism is a kind of despair, right? It's kind of epistemic despair. There are no trusted sources. Even the people that I like, I don't really trust them, right? So when my candidate for office makes some incendiary and inflammatory claim about immigration, I don't know whether to believe him or not. But, and this of course is similar to the motivational story, I find it affirming that he says those kinds of things, right? I don't know whether they're literally true. I don't even really know if they're close to true. But the resonance is appealing to me, right? So whether it's because I don't care about the facts, or I think differently because I just don't really think that the facts are something that I can have access to, in either case, I think what we see is a shift to a kind of consciously post-factual behavior, right? That what I look for when I hear political messages, even things that sound like empirical claims, right? People making claims about what's going on in the world. I'm not really listening to them with any expectation that I'm going to form beliefs. I'm really just listening for the signal value, right? I want to know what these statements tell me about the kind of person that I'm listening to, and fundamentally, whether they're on my team or not. So I could say much more, but I promised that I would not speak for overly long, and I hope I've kept that promise. I'm really interested to hear from the other members of our panel, and I think Max is going to introduce them to you now.
Thank you very much, Ian, for this very interesting and also highly illustrative presentation. I think it was very easy to get a sense of what you have in mind, and especially what kind of people you have in mind when you're referring to the different kinds of conscious post-factualism. So now it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage our three panelists. First, Elva Eir Gylfadóttir, who's the director of the Icelandic Media Commission. Then Hulda Þórisdóttir, who is my colleague at the Faculty of Political Science, professor with a specialization in political psychology, which is something that without which we actually cannot really meaningfully speak about post-truth politics. And finally, Ingólfur Bjarni Sigfússon, who is the editor of Kveikur. So, and I would propose that we give each of the three panelists some time to formulate some initial feedback to Ian's presentation. Then we give him a chance to respond, and then we open the floor to the general discussion. So, welcome to the stage. So who's starting? Elva, would you like to start?
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much for very interesting speech. It's very much talking into actually a survey that we will probably be publishing at the Media Commission either in the end of this week or the beginning of next, which is called Trust in Icelandic Society. Because what you're talking about, especially when it comes to the epistemic part, where you were describing these unconsciously post-factual politics, is that what we're seeing here in these numbers is exactly what you're talking about. Because we are constantly seeing people who don't seem to read the news. People are getting tired. They don't know. Maybe, I mean, there is so much facts out there. So in our survey, we see that it's a little bit more than half of the people who say that they keep themselves informed without following the news. Which is, how do you do that, of course? We had a survey 2 years ago asking about if people thought it was difficult to follow the news, and then it was only 12.7% stating that. Now it's up to 18.7%. So there is an increase by quite a few percentages in just a couple of years. And we also, and I think linked to this also is that people not necessarily wanting to discuss things, publicly. Maybe they don't feel that they have, that they have the facts right. But it's also because of the polarization in society that you don't know really. Are you going to be attacked if you say something? So, I mean, that is also part of what is happening, I think. And I think we can really relate to or see all of these 3 points here, because we as media authorities also in Europe, we are dealing with media and information literacy, and that's part of our legal mandate in all the European countries. And so we see this kind of exhaustion going on, but we also see this polarization, and we see that there are parts of the society who don't really believe in what the state institutions are saying, or and there is diminishing trust, of course. And in the Nordic context, I think that this is something that we need to be very, very much aware of. And the reason is that we are the countries in the world who have historically had the highest trust. And trust is something that you might not recognize it before it's actually lost. In a survey that was done, for example, by the Nordic Council of Ministers, they showed that just like if you get public trust up by 10%, that is like a half percentage that you can take up the income rate of your national product, in the society. So trust is such a big part. So what we are talking about here is not only democracy, but this is also something that is just can have effects on everything that we are doing. I mean, the transaction cost in a society where we don't have trust is of course much higher. That's something that we know if we have lived in the United States compared to the Nordics, for example. So many nice points here. I will stop here, but there are so many things to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elva. Ingolfur, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Well, I come at this, of course, from the non-academic perspective, but rather from one of the people who still try to do something that we think is based on facts and truth. And I ran into a story that was new to me, but it is not entirely new. It was indeed published in 1782 in the States. A gruesome story on the front page of the Independent Chronicle. And it basically, the headline was 700 scraps from our unhappy country folks. There were bags of boys, girls, and soldiers, and even infant scalps found in a bag, allegedly collected by Indians, who were sending it along with a friendly message to King George, their ally. Now, the newspaper that published the story is a real newspaper. It's the Independent Chronicle, a large Boston newspaper at the time. But this particular issue of the paper was neither printed nor published by the publisher, but rather it was printed in a small press in Paris at the behest of the then American ambassador to Paris, a gentleman called Benjamin Franklin. So fake news isn't an entirely new thing, and at least in that case, it was clear what his aim was. He was trying to persuade a particular group of people to form a particular opinion. I was a little bit more confounded by a fake news story that I read about this morning. Several American computer companies and think tanks are warning about Chinese propaganda or fake news being distributed and targeted at people in Hawaii regarding the recent fires in Hawaii, alleging that this is all due to some weather experiments done by the US. Apparently these fake news stories, which I didn't delve too much into, are followed by pictures quite obviously made with AI. So a little bit of critical thinking would probably cause you to go like, and you kind of have to wonder, what's the point? Now, maybe the Chinese are just preparing their channels and social media distribution networks for the coming election. Or maybe the point isn't really to persuade people, it's just to contribute to the noise. Now, I work for traditional media, and we've certainly been making a lot of noise, increasingly so since the advent of the internet. There's a lot of news stories and there's a lot of snippets. We have this wonderful Icelandic word called síbylja, and I'm sure we can all identify with, there's a lot of, even the real stuff, it's a lot to take. It's a lot to figure out, it's a lot to sort of process and understand and follow, because you get snippets and snippets and snippets, and you kind of have to be on it all the time. Add to that a Chinese AI picture about fires in Hawaii caused by God knows what, and all the other stuff, and you kind of go like, please, can I just have some quiet? Can I just get a day off? And what that may result in is something that was in another story this morning, published by The Guardian, based on research done by, hold your horses, George Soros Foundation. If you want to go into fake news, that's a name you can mention. About people's belief in democracy. It found that, well, let me get the numbers right, 86% of respondents would prefer to live in a democratic state, and only 20% believe authoritarian regimes are more capable of delivering what citizens need. The slightly more ominous number was only 57% of respondents aged 18 to 35 felt that democracy was preferable to other forms of government. 42% of younger people said they were supportive of military rule. You kind of have to scratch your head and go like, is that because they, apart from being just stuck on TikTok all the time, are also just have completely zoned out and have sort of lost the connection to reality and democracy, or what is happening here? It's certainly something that concerns me also as someone who's supposed to try to reach, as a public service media person who's supposed to reach these people. how do I get them? Who are they? Why are they? And what is happening? And maybe you can tell us.
All right, I think it's a little bit symbolic how our water glasses are here, because my glass tends to be half full. So that's also going to be how I talk, I guess, for the most part. So I approach this very much from psychological perspective, but also from some empirical data on Icelandic voters and youngsters. And just now I'm in the final stages of finishing a chapter on has the title something like Icelandic youths, can they be trusted for democracy, something like that. And overall, the answer is yes. So if we look at Icelandic young voters and their beliefs towards democracy and also their attitudes, they are very much pro-democracy. They're a little bit disillusioned, but they would definitely not prefer military rule. And
Well,
so
at least we have that.
if you are concerned for the future of liberal democracy in Iceland, you will be heartened after reading this particular study, I believe. But I do agree, of course, if you're focused on the young people, they do see a lot of stuff. But then again, my 13-year-old knows way more about politics in the world than I did when I was 13. So that he does not get from watching the news on Roof, but he gets from somewhere on social media. Anyway, but what I wanted to say, so we talk about post-factual era, fake news, but of course we should keep in mind, like you nicely illustrated here in the beginning, this is nothing new. This has been the case for a long, long time, that people have been lied to, and people have believed all sorts of outlandish stuff. They've been lied to by people who have something to gain from it financially. They've been lied to by spiritual leaders, been lied to by politicians, etc. And we can say in many ways that the era of, let's say, in the 20th century, even only after World War II or something, where we had very widespread, what we now call mainstream media, the big media companies that had basically almost all the power over information and the truth, that was an unusual period in history. And now that era is fading. We're no longer all getting the information from those few very controlled sources. And yes, that's new to us now, but it's not new to humankind. Before, in the 18th and 19th century, where did people get their information from? A lot of it came from rumor, right? And passed on. So, but I do think, like our main speaker here, Ian MacMullen, said, I think, well, you were alluding to, they're very complicated reasons. So there's no one reason. We can't pinpoint this is why this is happening. And like they've been saying, what's happening, we have inequality, we have lack of trust, we have polarization. And inequality, lack of trust, and polarization are all interconnected. And I strongly believe that we should not necessarily be worrying the most about the false information on YouTube, etc. Of course, we need to look at that as well. It needs to be monitored. I'm not saying that. But we do need to worry about the people who are attracted to that kind of information, who are disillusioned. Why are they disillusioned? Why do they not trust? What has happened? And it's very informative in that respect to compare different societies. Compare, the almost micronation of Iceland and the US. We don't have this level of polarization as you do in the US. We don't have the strong identity politics. Yes, of course, we do have some people who are strongly identified with their political party and always done, but we know from studies that political identification has loosened up a lot in Iceland. Yes, we are polarized on some certain issues, but for the most part, we're not. We're if we put a measure on it, we're very, very low on polarization compared to other countries. And what do we have? We have less fake news here, also because we are a smaller society, so it's harder to create. But it's reflected in other things. We have higher trust take-up of the vaccine, for example, is very high here. Trust in authorities when dealing with the pandemic was very high. So I think there's something very interesting in comparing countries here to look at the societal reasons for why this is happening. But I do strongly believe in your motivational account as a psychologist, that people, it doesn't happen, not all of us sit down in front of YouTube and all of a sudden we find ourselves at the bottom of the rabbit hole and believe the world is run by aliens or something like that. It doesn't happen. It happens to some people. It doesn't happen to everyone. So there's a reason. Yes, there are some psychological factors. We know it's related to some type of, mental disturbances, but for the most part, it's not that. There are other reasons, societal reasons we need to look at. So to make sure people feel included, feel listened to, and in the Icelandic perspective, I don't even start to discuss how we do it in the US, but in the Icelandic context, we need to make sure that we empower our young people to feel that they can have influence, that they are listened to as citizens, etc. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then I would like to give the floor back to Ian for some responses to those points.
You can just sit like this one if you like. Sorry.
Then I can just stand here.
I'll try to be really brief. Thank you, all three of you. That was super interesting. I'll just try to make two really quick points, and then presumably we're going to have a chance to hear from folks in the audience here. So I'll say one quick thing about noise, and then one quick thing about trust. Actually, maybe I'll do them the other way around. Let's do trust first, because that was a key theme in the responses we heard. So I suppose what I think about trust is that trust is enormously important, but of course it has to be placed in the correct in the correct way, right? So in some ways, the standard worry about post-factual politics that I described is that there's a lot of trust, it's just misplaced, right? That people are trusting the wrong sources and are unable to distinguish between genuine expertise and charlatans, right? Or people who really are just driven by interests and values and not by any kind of objective commitment to the truth. So trust is a good thing when it's appropriately directed. And what I try to suggest with my kind of concept of epistemic post-factualism is that what's really worrying is that when we see a sort of complete generalized distrust, right, this kind of despairing attitude that I described, that just doesn't seem like we can trust anyone any longer. And so I think in terms of thinking about the solutions to this sort of post-factual problem, I think part of the challenge is to really help young people understand the mechanics of the scientific process and of the journalistic community, to take two very important sources of knowledge in our society, so that people are actually able to distinguish between the kinds of sources that, although not infallible, nonetheless are deserving of our trust, and those that really are just making stuff up with a political agenda. So that's trust. And then quickly on noise, yeah. So right. So fake news is not new, right? There's always been fake news. That's definitely right. And lying is is a political strategy, of course, with a long history. But I think that the noise, the sheer volume of false and sometimes blatantly false claims that are out there in our political environment, that I think is new, and partly just because technology has enabled just an overwhelming barrage of empirical claims that are, descending upon us every day through every conceivable channel. And so the worry there, I think, is that despair is in a way a natural, almost a rational kind of response to being barraged with all that information. Who has time, who has the energy to sort through all of this stuff? And so I think one of the roots of what I've been calling epistemic post-factualism is this sense that people are simply being overwhelmed, and that to attempt to distinguish sources and judge their reliability strikes many people, understandably perhaps, as beyond them. And so this sort of instinct to say, well, I just need to think about my political behavior differently, because I love that line about people who are keeping themselves informed without following the news, right? It's kind of like, well, maybe there's got to be some other kind of strategy here, right? Some other way of orienting myself in politics rather than trying to deal with this overwhelming flood of supposed information. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And then we can actually open the floor for questions from the auditorium. Yes, please. I think there are, or at least I hope there are microphones.
Maybe I could just take one of those and just pass it around.
Sure.
Thank you very much, all of you. And my name is Sigrid Duna, and I come from anthropology, where we traditionally studied small society. And I would like to ask if anyone has thought about the importance of size in all of this. What Hilda was saying about the difference between the Icelandic scenario in this and what Ingólfur was saying about what the Guardian reported. Could that be a matter of size? And also about the noise that Ian was thinking about. Is that also a matter of size? I mean, how much we are getting, the size of the so-called information we are getting, the magnitude of it, which is kind of a size. So my question is, has anybody thought to look into the importance of size in what is happening? Thank you.
I can say a little bit about that, but do you want to go first? Okay. I've looked at it a little bit. The Nordic countries are all small countries, but I don't know if you're thinking small communities, like anthropological scale. No, just countries. Yeah. I don't think there is a very strong. You have plenty of small countries in the world with high levels of corruption, where you then have low trust and people are likely to not believe. So I don't think it's a clear-cut answer to that. I have often talked about it as one reason why trust is high in Iceland, but I don't. There's not strong empirical evidence on it. I think maybe someone else knows more about it, though. But all I know is that there's plenty of small states with high levels of distrust and corruption, as you know as well. So.
I'm certainly not an expert on this, but what I would wonder is whether it's less size than it is heterogeneity of population. So one characteristic of some, but not all, small societies is that they're relatively homogeneous in ways that can make it harder to get a very tribal approach to politics going if people actually feel that they are largely of a sort of shared identity. So it will tend to be the case, I suppose, that larger societies are more likely to be heterogeneous in the kinds of ways that can feed the sort of polarization that in turn can yield a sort of tribal approach to empirical claims and a post-factual politics. So I'm not an expert, but my hunch would be that if size is playing a role, it might be because it's sort of a proxy for heterogeneity on certain crucial sort of identity dimensions that are often driving these effects.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting lecture. Quick question. My name is Björn, and I work in the mobile app business. Regarding misplaced trust, with the rise of AI-generated content and deepfake technology, aren't we just in the early phase of the avalanche that's coming? I mean, within 2-3 years, a very large part of online content will be AI-generated. And the deepfake technology allows you to allow anyone to say anything you want. And there's no way you can see the difference. So my question is, what does the legislature has to do, and the regulators, because it's my firm belief that we are just beginning to understand the avalanche that's coming very quickly.
Do you want to start? Should I start? Okay. Since I am the one working for the government, sitting in this panel, I just wanted to mention the AI Act, of course, of the European Union. There is also a lot of work being done, a treaty actually, in the Council of Europe on this regard. But I think that the problem here, and just like you were mentioning, I mean, in a recent Europol publication, they were estimating that in 2026, in 3 years, 90% of all content on the internet will be AI generated. So this is going to happen really fast. That's for sure. And the problems, of course, with disinformation and fake news and all that is enormous. And I think that the problem also from the legislative point of view is that you don't really know how to step down, and that is quite apparent when you're looking at the drafts that have already been done, and also in the kind of like framework on this treaty of the Council of Europe. That so you don't want to kind of like, you know, step down too fast and too hard, because you want the development to take place, but then we don't really know, you know, where we are going to have the biggest problems in the near future, and let alone like 10 or 20 years ago. So this is kind of like the scenario that we're working from. Unfortunately, I think I'm probably the person here who is like the bad cop, coming with the bad news here at the panel. But do you want to add to this? What is happening in the US, maybe?
Well, I mean, all I'll say is that I think it's enormously worrying. The technological change is surely outstripping our epistemic tools, right? How will we learn? And how quickly can we learn not to trust our own eyes and ears? I mean, I'm not an evolutionary scientist, right? But my hunch is that as humans, we just are going to struggle mightily with this, because surely we are wired to see an incredibly lifelike image of someone saying something in exactly the voice that we know is their real voice, and just to trust what we see. And it is deeply alarming to me, and I can't help but be very pessimistic about our capacity to deal with an information environment in which these kinds of deep fake, audiovisuals are just going to be ubiquitous. And the worry, I suppose, in my conceptual terms is that this might lead to a world in which it is rational for most of us to be epistemically post-factual, right? That the despair might start to seem like an entirely appropriate kind of reaction if one just truly does not have any way to distinguish the genuine from the incredibly convincing fake. I wish I had something more positive to say, but I'm struck by that.
I want to add to that, just, a speculation I dare to state before I finish my class, is that I do wonder if the times we are about to enter are good news for mainstream classic media, because now we have to shift through, like, what can I believe? Well, maybe I can't believe the New York Times. Maybe I can't believe Roof. And so it may take us back to that era. Like, I cannot trust this and that, but those are at least sources I can trust. I don't know. It's just speculation. You shake your head. You don't believe that's true because maybe others will pop up. It will just lead to even more polarization. So, but we will need to find some new way of trusting. And how will we pick that? Well, maybe just more fragmentation. I don't know.
Quick follow-up with on Alva, and maybe you can't answer this question because 90% of content online will be AI deepfakes or AI generated. It just sounds like the end of times. Incredibly dystopian.
Europol said it.
Well, yes, and I believe it, but a large portion of that will be cat videos. It won't all be fake news.
Porn.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be a celebrity or a cat. I'm guessing those will be the categories that most of the effort is spent on. That's not to make light of it. That's just, it's not all going to be, whatever president is in the White House saying something obnoxious.
I'm the pessimist, I think, here. Well, I mean, it's also going to be so much that we are seeing, like, in comments under whatever that we are reading. It's going to be astroturfing, where you think that there is, for example, lobbyism going on, but you have just like, yeah. So, and how are you going to know what is real and what not? So, because this is going to be a challenge, of course, because it's going to kind of like slide into everything, both the cat videos, but also into like. Is it real? A person who was actually sending this into the parliament because of this bill, which was there, or is that astroturfing, part of something like that? So this is kind of the challenge, part of it at least.
Hilda, please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Hilda Skogland. I work for the Directorate of Education here in Iceland. I would love to hear MacMullen's thoughts on the role of education in preventing or building both trust, but also preventing issues like fake news. And 3 hours ago, the OECD came out with their flagship report, comparative report on education at a glance. And this year they also, they focus on that this year, but they also focus on post-truth politics and the role of education or educational attainment in belief in conspiracy theories. So there's so much we can look at, but I would love to hear your thoughts, because I know that you've looked into it on the role of education, but also on what matters in education in your belief.
Yeah, thank you. I have thought some about this. So here's one thought that I have. I don't know how far this goes, but my sense is that a lot of attempts to educate children for citizenship in this confusing information environment go under the heading of sort of media literacy, right? How to consume the news, or engage with the information ecosystem in a way that is literate in the sense that it's discerning. And I think that much of what is currently done is trying to teach children to identify unreliable sources. What are the the warning signs when you find something on the web or something shows up in your social media. What are the warning signs that should make you think this may not be trustworthy? That, my understanding is that very roughly that's kind of the main thrust of a lot of the education that is being designed and provided for children. And if I'm right about the fact that it's not just a problem of false beliefs with people trusting stuff they shouldn't trust, then what I would add to that is that I think that at the same time that we're teaching children to be more discerning consumers of purported news, we also need to make sure that we are not making them excessively cynical so that they will reflexively just assume that all sources are biased, because if my epistemic post-factual worry is onto anything, then this is like the opposite problem, right? That we might be training children to just assume that there are no reliable sources because there's always biases and there's always values that are kind of undermining the epistemic credentials of anyone. And that can lead to this sort of generalized distrust, which I'm worried about. So my hunch is that what we need to do is to give children more of a kind of concrete sense of how legitimate news organizations and legitimate scientific operations work. That the way to overcome some of the generalized sort of skepticism that there is now around these traditional sources is to actually give children, I don't know, a sort of hands-on sense of how journalism is actually done, and indeed of how science is actually done, so that they can learn in a very concrete way that there's something different about these sources. They're not perfect, but you can learn by seeing and doing that they are at least presumptively reliable, and that they shouldn't simply be dismissed in the same way that children are appropriately learning that some sources need to be instinctively sort of distrusted.
Can I add to this? Yes, this is extremely important, but research all over Europe is also showing that it's not only children and youth, of course, that needs to be educated. So one of the most vulnerable group is people who are 60 and over, and the older they are, the more vulnerable they are, which means that this is something that we need to address to everyone in society in appropriate ways. We need to put it in, of course, in the curriculum, have it in the schools, and but this is also an ongoing discourse, like we are having now, that needs to take place all the time, just to remind us what is happening, and so we can understand the changes that are being made, I think.
The floor is open, and there's one hand. I'm always hoping that at some point there's going to be no hand so that I can say something, but please.
Yes, hi. My name is Emma, and I'm a trainee at the European Union delegation. And I was just wondering, because I've studied political science at the University of Iceland, see a bunch of my teachers here, nice to see you again. And I was just wondering, because we're talking about the technological advances and how that has affected political trust, and because it's often talked about in a very negative sense, that social media, because the advent of social media, this has happened and this has happened, but then we see traditional media such as RÚV having a bigger presence on the internet, such as on TikTok and Facebook and stuff. So I'm just wondering, is this a case of us needing to adjust to this new reality? Or, because as I said, a lot of people think of it as kind of a bad development But is it that, or is it just us needing to find out how we can adjust to this new reality?
Well, let me pick up on that one. This may not be the target group that is aware that Dhruv is on TikTok, but we are. And there's a lot of engagement with what we put on there. But it wasn't sort of something that happened just because, or without giving it some thought. TikTok, if we take that as an example, of course, sort of controversial, as it's a Chinese medium and how they process data and guard privacy is one thing, but also their algorithms are even more sort of hard to crack and understand than of many of the Western-based social media. And yet, this is where a large portion of Icelandic youth in particular spend a huge portion of their times. They probably engage more with content via TikTok than any other form of media. So you sort of have to weigh, do you go into a platform that is, let's say, questionable, but is the source of information and all sorts of information for Icelandic youth? And do you say, we go there just, because at least we are a public service, it is our role to engage with the public and try to present fair and unbalanced and moderately well-researched news? Or do we say, we'll stay out, we don't want to touch this, and what these kids are doing there is none of our concern? I'm not sure there's a right answer to that. You can probably argue both fairly well. But our call was, okay, we at least we'll try this. We'll see if we see kids engaging with the content, using the content, if it's something they seem to pick up on. And at least that we've been there for about a year. So far, indications are that this is something that kids are looking at. This is what to an extent informing their conversation and then understanding of the world. So it's not just influencers or whatever the algorithm is otherwise pushing at them. Will it stay that way? Well, as the algorithm evolves and media change, we don't really know. But I think our argument was it's not defensible to leave kids somewhere and just say, we don't go into that neighborhood. But at the same time, of course, maybe we're contributing to them spending more time on TikTok and seeing more shady stuff. So.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Brynhildur and I work for the National Electoral Committee, Landskjörstjórn. I'm having trouble forming a question. Maybe you can just elaborate on it. We have some issues with trusted institutes. Maybe like in the US, the police is not really, the people aren't trusting them really much. And then we have some other forms like OxyContin and the medical industry and women not being listened to at the hospital and so on and so on. So there are reasons for people not to maybe always trust the institutions or the people that they are supposed to trust. That isn't a factor in this, isn't it? It's not. And why not? And why people that, or I'm asking, is it a factor? The people that, I don't know, don't trust the police in the US, are they deep into fake news? I don't think so. I don't think that has anything to do. Do you know where I'm going? I just find it interesting that there are reasons not to believe something that you're told. And that has nothing to do with this.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And trust is a dangerous thing, right? Yeah, we have to learn to trust, but we also have to learn to distrust. And there are many circumstances in which distrust is a perfectly appropriate baseline attitude to have. In America, one thing, my wife is a doctor and has done a certain amount of work trying to encourage people to take the COVID vaccine, and has encountered various different forms of skepticism about the vaccine, one of which comes from Black Americans who are understandably concerned that the history of America is one in which often Black Americans have been experimented upon. Black Americans have often been excluded from clinical trials, and in a variety of different ways, you know, Black Americans have, you might say, a very rational kind of distrust in the medical establishment. This is very difficult, right? Because, and I should add, my wife is Black, so she's talking often to Black patients and engaged in a very complex kind of relationship building with them, attempting to, on the one hand, reassure them about the good reasons to take the COVID vaccine, but not to deny or you know, minimize their legitimate concerns about the racial history of how public health and medicine have been practiced in the country. So it is very, very difficult, and it's very easy for people who belong to historically privileged, you know, establishment groups in society to say we ought to trust all our institutions, we should trust the police, we should trust the government, we should trust the scientists. Obviously, you know, some people have much less reason to distrust than others, and that is, I think that's a really important perspective.
I just want to add one thing here, because I think we are also talking very much about culture when we are talking about this. So I remember I had a conversation with some Irish colleagues when I was working in the ministry, and they were doing some changes to the license fee of to the public service broadcaster in Ireland. And we had just done some changes here. And we were talking about whether it should be a household tax or you know, for individuals and things like that. And you know, we are quite you know, alike. We have a lot in common. But in this particular conversation, we just realized Ireland and Iceland, two small societies, historically quite homogenic, that there is a complete the match of trust was very, very different in the Nordics and in Ireland, for example. And the reason was, you know, you would never have like social security number, or like everybody knows where you live, you know, you have the addresses and so forth. And this, for them, they were like, no, but we can't use any of this. And, you know, and I was like, but how do you know even where people live? Well, we have very good postmen in Ireland. You know, that was like the, and I was like, yeah, but, so you're just estimating everything here. So I think that we're talking about trust, having lived in the UK and the US, the level of trust, you know, in society is very different from what we are used to here. And I also wanted to say that we are not talking about like trust. Of course we should have questions about everything. You know, if there is, if we see that we can't trust something, of course we should mistrust that. But what I think that what we are talking about here is trust that is kind of like created just because, and it's maybe completely unfounded, because it just comes from noise. For us, you know, asking us just to question everything, because we don't know what is true anymore. So that is a very different thing. And also, since we have so much trust, that we can even see the social security number of anyone living in this country, that, you know, that level of trust as we have it now, of course it will go down very quickly and much quicker than in other societies where the level of trust is lower. So we have much more to lose as well. So I think that is also a very important point.
I just want to add a little anecdote. One could argue maybe that social and political trust in Iceland was maybe a little bit too high before economic crisis, because maybe we weren't critical enough. And so it was easy to tell us everything was fine. And of course, on top of that, we were all motivated to believe it because we were all gaining from it. So yeah, I certainly agree that some level of distrust is desirable. The problem is figuring out that balance. You're going to solve it in like 3 minutes we have left. So.
Yes, please.
Yeah, one question just for our main speaker. I was thinking about where do you mainly gain your data and information in relation to your research that you have been presenting today?
I wish you hadn't asked that question. So, I am a proud member of the subfield of political science that calls itself political theory. And so I don't do empirical research. I'm not out there kind of conducting surveys or case studies. So as I sort of probably failed to fully disclose at the outset, I try to do primarily what I call conceptual work, which is that I'm really trying to think through sets of possibilities. And so, but you're right to implicitly call me out on this, because I get a little lazy, right, or at least I overclaim. And in this context, I shouldn't be overclaiming, right, because we're talking about sort of justified trust. To be clear, I have a set of hypotheses based on having thought and engaged in a conceptual debate with colleagues around the world. I have a set of hypotheses about the different kinds of things that I think could be going on. Conceptually, the different possibilities for explaining the phenomenon of post-factual politics. I haven't tested those hypotheses. I'm not sure I, have the credentials or the skills to do that. But I ought to be clearer than I probably sometimes am about when I actually have a sort of, an empirical claim to make about the world, which is not actually very often, and when I'm really just trying to kind of orient us towards the possibilities, so that others who presumptively have much more sort of actual sort of empirical expertise on this topic than me, can perhaps look in some different places, so to speak, or look for some things that we might otherwise not be looking for. So I should have probably offered that disclaimer more clearly than I did. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that.
Thank you very much, Ian. And unfortunately, now we are out of time. So all that's left for me to do is to thank, of course, everybody who's contributed to this. Thank you, Ian, for the introductory speech, and thank you to our three panelists for the wonderful discussion. Thank you everybody who came here for the great questions. And of course, thanks to the US Embassy, thanks to the Media Commission of Iceland, and thanks, of course, also to the Institute of International Affairs for making this happen. Thank you very much.